am thrilled to welcome to our Justice Matters channel my friend Kim Wehle. Kim is a constitutional law professor who has been teaching for 15, 17 years now. She's also a separation of powers expert. Kim is a former federal prosecutor. She's an ABC legal analyst. I could go on and on. She is an author of now 4 books, and her new book is dropping as we speak. And I'll tell you, it couldn't be more timely. The book is called Pardon Power: How the Pardon System Works and Why. And this is actually the 4th book in a long line of not how-to books, but why-to books, how to read the Constitution and why, what to know about voting rights and why. And I'll tell you, Kim, I just finished Pardon Power, and it reads more like a crime thriller and a mystery novel than it does sort of a dense historical text full of legal jargon. It is a compelling read, and I recommend it to everybody. I'll put a link to where they can find the book in the description of this video. But welcome back, Kim. I am always thrilled to sit down and talk with you.
Thank you, Glenn, for having me, and thank you for that tremendous introduction and for the snaps for the book. I think it surprises people how pardon power is kind of at the center of so much around criminal justice, around the Constitution, around executive power. And the stories are kind of jaw-dropping, how this has, kind of impacted society for positive and negative since the beginning of the Republic.
And now with the recent Supreme Court opinion on presidential immunity, we are right back into the thick of talking about, debating what the pardon power might mean if a president really does have far more immunity from prosecution for committing crimes against the American people in violation of our federal laws. If he or she has far more immunity against being held accountable, against prosecution, how does the pardon power fit into that? And what dangers are posed by a president who feels unconstrained ethically or on the moral front from exercising his pardon power? But I don't want to jump ahead of where I want to start with you. First of all, what is it that made you want to write a book about the pardon power?
I was actually invited by the publisher to write it as part of this series, this And Why series, as you describe it, because of the election. Understanding Donald Trump dangled pardons for people like Paul Manafort and Roger Stone, who got pardons, essentially quid pro quo. If you're silent, I will reward you. He is on record as saying it was his favorite thing when he was president because there was no accountability there. And of course, he's promised to pardon the 1,400 plus people that have been embroiled in the criminal justice system around the January 6th chaos. And there was a study done this summer of Americans on the pardon power, the first empirical research, and the majority of Americans, Glenn, including Republicans, don't want to see a self-pardon, don't want to see pardons for the January 6th insurrectionists, don't like corrupt, abusive pardons. And here we are with this collective shrug like, oh, this is just what happens. Presidents get to do this.
As I mentioned in the introduction, the first part of the book is really this historical overview, which is amazing. You actually start, I think, in like 1800 BC, and you take us through the present day. And you might think that that would be dull, just kind of reading the history of how the pardon power has been treated over time. But it reads more like a Hollywood script. I'm reading it and I'm like, oh, what's happening to the pardon power next? And I have to admit, Kim, when I got to about the 1600s, there was something that I read that caused me to immediately think about our last president, Donald Trump. And let me just quote it. You say, in one case, King James II exchanged a pardon for 16,000 pounds sterling, which he received one half of, and the other half was divided among 2 ladies then most in favor. And I don't know why that reminded me of Donald Trump just sort of enriching himself and others who may be in his favor at the moment. But if you can give us, this is an impossible task, of kind of the arc, where the pardon power originated and where it landed, at least in the United States today.
Well, I think there's some version of it in every country except China on the planet. And as you indicate, it's as old as law itself. And the idea originally is to allow the sovereign to, or the people, in Roman times, it was the people that would vote. Jesus was denied a pardon in favor of murderer Barabbas and was executed, and that was a vote by the people. The idea is when there was no criminal justice system, when it was kind of people fighting each other in the streets, there was a need for someone to come in and exercise mercy. So that is the one, I think, legitimate reason for the pardon power. And then sometimes it would be done en masse for lots and lots of people. The very first pardon that was issued by a president was by George Washington, pardoning the Whiskey Rebellion contributors, because the idea was sometimes we just need to move on. But as you indicate, all along, because any unaccountable power can get abused. James Madison said, if men were angels, we wouldn't need a government. It was abused. I mean, the kings also would pardon people to send them to the New World, to send them to Australia, populate the New World with criminals, or in exchange for joining the military, there'd be pardons. But I think what people don't understand are two things about the modern pardon power. The first is that King George III, at the time of ratification of the Constitution, had constraints on the pardon power in England. So we now are operating, including our United States Supreme Court and, frankly, the Justice Department, in the oral argument on the immunity decision, seems to be operating on this assumption the President of the United States in 2024 has more pardon power than the king did at the time of the Revolutionary War. And that's just a tremendous mythology. And the other piece is the idea that, well, there's no limits. It would be unconstitutional to constrain the pardon power. And the court, as I talk about in the book, has actually already imposed some limits on the pardon power. So to get back to your other question, the reason I wrote the book is because this needs clarification and it needs some attention.
And I have to admit, as you were going through in the book, some of the pardons that we have seen issued here in the United States, I also paused on the Blackwater pardons, in part because that was a case prosecuted by my former office, and your former office, the DC U.S. Attorney's Office, by a very good friend of mine, homicide colleague who I tried murder cases with, a prosecutor named Pat Martin, who prosecuted that case 3 times. And for the folks who don't know, this Blackwater, they were contractors who were over in Iraq and Baghdad, providing some security assistance to some dignitaries and some folks over there. And I think you can say in hindsight, they were kind of trigger happy. I was involved in this case behind the scenes, so I know a good deal about it. And they opened fire for absolutely no legitimate reason on a car that contained a young man taking his mother, who was a doctor at a local hospital, to work, killed them, and ended up killing 17 Iraqis, injuring another 20. We decided to try to bring them to justice here in the United States for what they did. Pat Martin tried them 3 times total. They were convicted. And then Donald Trump swooped in and pardoned them all. This was a massacre. And I can recall some of these Iraqis who survived the attack or who were surviving family members of the folks who were killed weeping in court and saying, I didn't think the United States of America would care about what happened to us. And they were so grateful that our office and our prosecutors undertook this extraordinary prosecution. And then Donald Trump just wiped it all away with the sign of a pen. And it just struck me as this extreme injustice. There was nothing merciful about it. There was nothing righteous about it. And, that is the kind of thing that really hits home. You are undermining the work that was done by law enforcement, by multiple federal agencies, by prosecutors, and you are re-victimizing the victims and their family members all over again. So I will say, Kim, I'm glad you wrote about that one, and that one really hit home for me.
And we can speculate why that would happen, right? So that's not a merciful pardon, meaning back in common law England, there was no criminal justice system. There weren't what you're describing. There weren't juries until the 13th century. There weren't constitutional rights for criminal defendants in these kinds of appeals. But Blackwater was run by Eric Prince, who was Betsy DeVos's brother, and Betsy DeVos was the Department of Education secretary under Donald Trump. George W. Bush said on his way out of office something to the effect of, listen, these last-minute pardons by and I'm paraphrasing, by people with money and access, this isn't a good system. So, presidents should come in and have a process. And meanwhile, there are hundreds of thousands of people with extraordinary sentences that are low income, mental health problems, addiction problems, abusive childhoods, all kinds of reasons that you might want to say, wait a minute, this sentence is too severe, I'm going to commute it. That's a form of a sentence. But I don't think under any sort of reasonable definition of a mercy is the Blackwater pardons justified. And as you indicate, the pardon's this weird thing, because we've talked about this before. The framers took the monarchy and split it into three parts so that no one would have all the power. The judges, the president, and Congress. What a pardon does is it wipes out the work of the rest of the executive branch, the prosecutors, the law enforcement officials, and it wipes out the work of the courts and the juries. These are juries of these defendants' peers sometimes, and it just obliterates all of it with no process, but by a stroke of a pen, no accountability, and no record. There's not even a record of why. There's no federal ban on lobbying for pardons. Rudy Giuliani ran around offering $2 million for pardons. Jared Kushner, who was Donald Trump's son-in-law, he was not on the federal payroll. And he was reportedly the pardon czar. And his own father got a pardon, whom Chris Christie prosecuted, former New Jersey governor, said he was one of the most despicable defendants he's ever succeeded in putting in jail. So we all are seeing this as an extraordinarily corrupt process. And as I said in the book, it just attempts to start the conversation around this. At the same time, Glenn, we're having a broader conversation about the fate of our democracy that is now ticking away to November.
Yeah, and Kim, I think there is one primary reason that this parade of horribles that you were just laying out is allowed to continue. And you talk about that in your book. To say that the pardon power has no constraints whatsoever isn't logically sound. And you add, if a corrupt pardon were ever to make its way to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court, should take the case and should hold that the pardon power can't be used that way. But I think on page 206 is where you hit the nail right on the head about why we remain forever just kind of treading water on this issue of, corrupt pardons being used over and over again, and not just, in my opinion, by the Trump administration, though he seemed to be the king, no pun intended, of the corrupt pardon. You say on page 206, you lay out one particularly odious pardon that was granted by Donald Trump to somebody named Paul Pogues, whose son had donated $385,000 to Trump's reelection campaign, including $100,000 worth of private air travel. And Trump goes ahead and pardons that person's father. Okay, that feels dirty. That feels cruddy. But you say there is no law expressly banning pardons for money, although they could conceivably qualify as a bribe. Establishing that precedent would require a prosecutor willing to bring that charge. And therein is the problem. If you don't have prosecutors willing to challenge corruptly delivered pardons or apparently corruptly delivered pardons, then we're never going to get any precedent on whether the Constitution envisions corrupt pardons being good to go in the United States. So what do you think about the prospects of prosecutors ever challenging some of these corruptly delivered pardons?
John Dean wrote the foreword, who, of course, was White House counsel under President Nixon, and he ended up going to prison over his role in Watergate. And he argues that with this new immunity case, Nixon would have gotten away with all of it. But he talks about, Jimmy Hoffa. He drafted the commutation for him. He was a gangster, teamster, and he did challenge the scope of his pardon. So a defendant could bring it up in some context, but prosecutors could bring a quid pro quo case in Mary Jo White, I believe, in the Southern District of New York. And when she was U.S. attorney, she investigated Bill Clinton's pardon of Mark Rich, who also gave a lot of money to the Clinton interests. It was a last-minute pardon that Clinton is on record as having regretted because he says it tarnished his reputation. They didn't bring any charges. Congress also, with respect to that particular pardon, underwent some hearings on this prospect of quid pro quo pardons. And of course, Congress could pass a law. Glenn, why not ban expressly quid pro quo pardons? That would be litigated, and then we would have an answer. Why not ban lobbying for pardons? Why not ban members of Congress from seeking pardons, right? 6 members of Congress are on record as having sought pardons from Donald Trump regarding their involvement in the January 6th insurrection. Now, this was before any charges were brought by the Justice Department, Glenn. Why are you running around trying to get pardons from the President of the United States, Donald Trump, if you're not concerned about your own criminal welfare? So, yeah, I think it's an appetite that's missing, both in the Justice Department and Congress. But part of it is also, again, we just assume it's just like I've been criticized on when it used to be Twitter for even suggesting there are limits on the pardon power by other scholars. There's just kind of this knee-jerk reaction. And it stems back from some cases during the Civil War where Abraham Lincoln pardoned Confederates and said, you can get your property back that was confiscated. Congress came in and said, no, we don't want all this largesse for Confederate soldiers. We're going to pass a law saying you can't have your property back. And when there was that clash between Lincoln and Congress at the time of the Civil War, the Supreme Court sided with Lincoln. And there's some language in those old cases that have now ballooned into this idea that even a pardon that's a bribe would somehow be okay, because we're not even looking at that, Glenn. I mean, you were a prosecutor for forever. I mean, prosecutors aren't looking into these cases when, at a minimum, I guess someone would say, well, there can't be limits on the pardon power. But as we know, the Constitution is clear that bribery is a basis for impeachment. So the framers, we have direct evidence and language in the Constitution, which is an old document, it's very short, that bribery is a basis for impeachment. And the framers went on to say, and if you're impeached for bribery or other high crimes and misdemeanors, you can go on and be prosecuted. So what more would a prosecutor need, Glenn, than black and white in the United States Constitution, other than the courage and the political will to do it? And I know there's a lot of pushback on this, partly because there's so much misinformation and disinformation around the scope of this power.
Yeah, and of course, very different atmospherics and concerns in play when Lincoln was undertaking to, kind of save the Union. And it's not like we don't revisit Supreme Court precedent over time. Hello, Dred Scott, Plessy versus Ferguson, Korematsu, and on the other side of the equation, revoking women's constitutional privacy rights. So we do it all the time. And, when you even have somebody like Bill Barr, who I rarely quote as authority on anything, testifying before Congress that if a president were to deliver a pardon to somebody to buy that person's silence about the president's crimes, that would be unlawful, right? So you even have Bill Barr taking that position. And, I would point to the Roger Stone pardon as being completely corrupt. When you have Donald Trump, after Roger Stone lies to Congress to do what? Well, according to Judge Amy Berman Jackson, Roger Stone was not standing up for the president. Roger Stone was covering up for the president. She presided over Roger Stone's prosecution. I was in court watching the whole thing. And then you have Donald Trump, who told Roger Stone, stay strong, don't rat, don't flip on me, don't tell on me. And Roger Stone went to trial, was convicted, and Kim, I'll never forget, 3 days before he was to report to the Federal Bureau of Prisons to begin serving his 40-month sentence, he gave an interview to the late Howard Fineman, and he said, Mr. President, I stayed strong. I could have flipped. Things would have been much easier on me and my family, but I didn't. I want my sentence commuted. And later that day, Donald Trump commuted his sentence and went on to granting him a full pardon. Kim, I think you would agree with me that what I just described is the crime of obstructing justice.
You mentioned a federal judge said it on record.
How can it be that the Department of Justice doesn't have the appetite to take that up? I mean, there's no shame in taking that up and losing it and having the Supreme Court ultimately say, It doesn't violate the letter of the Constitution. It doesn't violate the spirit of the Constitution for a president to use pardons to protect himself against being held accountable for crimes. Heck, I guess you can set up a pardon kiosk at the front door of the White House, and Donald Trump can just sell pardons for $1 million a pop. I'm not sure how that meshes with the clause in the Constitution that says a president must take care to faithfully execute the laws of the nation. But how about we try the case? If we lose it, there's no shame. But declining to bring a case like that, I think there's nothing but shame, and I think it does a disservice to how we should be interpreting the Constitution. Kim, let me tell you, what a great conversation. I feel like this is us just talking over a beer more than it's an interview on my Justice Matters channel. So I really cannot recommend enough Kim's new book, The Pardon Power. If you care about the pardon power, and if you care about the health and viability of our democracy moving forward, I urge you to pick it up. It's a great read. It's a quick read. It's a really fun and exciting read. So I'll put a link to where you can find the book in the description of this video. And then this is a conversation that we're going to have to keep having because, this is going to remain relevant for, the months and years to come. So thank you so much for joining us today, Kim. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it was so fun. As always, thank you, Glenn, for having me.
Justice matters.